really good. Like, real good. Yeah, you can celebrate them. Yeah, that's awesome. It's cool to watch people. It's cool to watch people use their gifts and talents for Jesus. And one of my favorite other things about this series and the way we do it is that, so those two will go with me to the other campuses. And Chase is our worship leader in West Odessa. And Stephanie has been on our worship team in Monahans, I believe, since the beginning when we launched that campus. And so they're not from here. And so it's really cool to see how God has blessed our church at every location with just an exorbitant amount of talent. And we get to leverage that to tell his story throughout this series. That's what this is really all about. And one of the other really cool things I love about this series is usually I'm on a screen in Monahans and Andrews on Sunday morning and in West Odessa, and if I walk past here, I go off the screen. But today, I'm free. They told me, they said, you can walk the aisles if you want to. I was like, well, I don't know about that. That seems a little much, but we could give it a whirl. So if I get down there, just help me out, all right? So today we're going to look at, we're talking about that idea of shallowness and the relationships that often exist in our world and some of the things that we pair together. So I want you to think with me for a minute and help me out with this. If I were to say ketchup and you were thinking of a popular pair, if I were to say ketchup, what would you respond with? Ketchup and mustard, right? That's good. That's pretty good. If I were to say pancakes, what would you respond with? Pancakes and syrup. There's a few sinners who said waffles, and that's fine. We'll let you guys stay, but it's definitely syrup. That is definitely the most important thing to go with a pancake, right? Or salt and pepper, which is another good option. I don't mind pepper, but salt is definitely more important. But think about in the context of the spiritual life. Think of maybe this, if you grew up in a church or maybe you've heard stories. There's a guy in the Bible, David, that we mentioned. So if I were to say David, what would be the pairing you put with it? David and most of us would say Goliath. And the story of David and Goliath is a fascinating story, and it's a great story, and it's one that many of us are familiar with, as it seems. And if you're not, we're going to make you familiar with it briefly today. But the story of David and Goliath is not the most important story in David's life. In fact, it's not even the most important pairing in his life. He had a relationship that was far more important to who he became than his relationship to Goliath. You know, we have that sort of pairing in our own life, the pairing of us and others. If we aren't paired with other people, if we don't have interaction with other people, then it makes it really challenging and I would say impossible to do God's work and God's plan in our life. Just psychologically, this is true. We know that babies are less healthy and can die without interaction. We know that adults get depressed and suicidal without other people in their life. We need relationships to do life, and what I believe we're going to discover today is that we need relationships to do life God's way. That's why I believe that real relationships provide a pathway to your purpose. Real relationships provide a pathway to your purpose. A couple of years ago, my wife and I was on our 5th anniversary, and we went on a cruise in the Caribbean. And so I don't like motion, so I get motion sick. And so we flew to Puerto Rico, and then we got on a boat that stopped at an island every day, so there were no fun days at sea, which did not sound fun at all to me. I was going to be sick the whole time. And so we're on this cruise, and we stopped at all these different islands, and one of the places we stopped was a place called St. Martin, and we went on an excursion away from the boat and out to do something fun. And this fun thing was they were going to put some weight on us and drop us to the bottom of the ocean so that we could walk on the bottom of the ocean. It sounded like a good idea. It was a cheap version of scuba diving without all the training. And so we get there to this place, and they're giving us our helmets and the orientation, and this helmet is weighted down so you'll fall to the bottom of the ocean, and then it's connected to like this tube that provides oxygen into your helmet. I'm describing it now. It seems like a really terrible idea, actually. I'm not going to recommend it. But anyway, so we're down there, and they're giving us orientation. Well, I don't do rules very well. I don't pay attention when people are giving rules very well. And so this guy is giving the rules, and all I'm thinking to myself is, wait a minute, has anybody ever thought about the shark situation? This is the ocean. Like, this isn't a private diving place. This is the ocean. What about the sharks? And so I'm thinking to myself, well, I mean, you know, I got a knife. I brought a knife with me. I guess I could fight a shark with a knife. I don't know what I'm going to do. And so I'm about to ask the question, what do I do if I see a shark? And then I realize that's probably not a good question to ask. So I lean over to the guy, and I'm like, what do you think we do with a shark? You think we just stab him? He's like, I ain't stabbing no shark. I'm stabbing you. And then I'm going to swim away. It's not a bad idea. though I would not have a wife if I did that with my wife. But to us, in our world, like sometimes that's the relationships that we have, right? The relationships we have are so self-centered and so self-driven until there's a moment in our time when we realize, oh, that's not as real of a relationship as I thought. And sometimes it's a result of us not offering forgiveness, but in many ways, it's real relationships that reveal who we really are. It's real relationships that can help us to understand what we don't know or don't see about us. Real relationships have been a part of God's plan since the very beginning. 1,000 years before Christ ever walked to the earth, history tells us, and the Bible confirms for us, that there was this new nation burgeoning in the Middle East called Israel. And Israel had its first king. They had been a nation without a king for many years. They had been led by God, and so they never had a king. And so they decided they had to have a king because they wanted to be like all the other nations around them, right? That was their thought process. That's written in 1 Samuel. You can go read it. And it's mind-blowing to think of the choices that they would make in a situation like that. God tells them, if I give you a king, he's going to tax you. He's gonna make slaves of some of your people. He's gonna take you to war over causes that you don't believe in. And they say, we want a king anyway. And so they end up with this king, and he looks like this, or artist rendition of this. This is King Saul. So King Saul is the first king of Israel. He's known as being tall, dark, and handsome. And so a prophet goes to his house one day, pours oil in his head, and says, you're going to be the king for God. And so God chose him as the first king. And shortly into his kingship, he chose to reject God. And as a result, he's troubled his entire life from those choices that he makes and the choices he continues to make to reject God in his life. So one of the good things that he does is has a son. And that son's name is Jonathan, who looks a little like this. That is kind of a feminine picture of Jonathan, from what I'm going to tell you, but nonetheless, somebody in the Renaissance probably painted a picture like that of Jonathan. But Jonathan is the firstborn son. He's the prince of Israel. And based on culture and tradition, he should become the next king. He's a great warrior. And while David, the king we're talking about, while David is still a teenager, Jonathan has a command over a third of the army of King Saul. And he's not like the guy who, works for maybe your boss or your friend's boss or whatever, whose dad owns the company, so they're a vice president. Jonathan has earned his way up there. He's a courageous warrior in his own right. In fact, before David ever fought Goliath, Jonathan did something just as bold with the same impact, a very similar impact. There was an occasion when this group of people called the Philistines, they're a group of people that Israel would continually fight with, like 100 years war. And they would continue to fight with these people over different stuff. And at one point, the Philistines had put together this enormous army, and it had 3,000 chariots, which were like battle tanks in that day, or 6,000 horsemen and numerous foot soldiers. 1 Samuel says that they looked like the sand on the seashore. And the Israelites had 600 men left in the army because everyone looked at what was there and they deserted and ran away. And not only did they just have 600 men, but they had 600 men and only 2 swords. See, a generation before, the Israelites had taken them over. They'd killed all the blacksmiths and eliminated that from being legal in Israel. And so nobody was allowed to make swords. So you had 600 men. 2 of them had swords, the king and his son Jonathan. And all these other men had pitchforks. They were literally an army of pitchforks and shovels and other farming tools. And so it's just, they're outnumbered, they're outgunned. It's a very desperate situation. Many of them are hiding in caves and thickets, including King Saul. But Jonathan didn't go into hiding. In fact, he approached the Philistines and he says, I want to engage with you. I want to have a conversation that changes the narrative of this whole thing. So he has a conversation with his armor bearer, which is like his personal bodyguard. And so this is what he says to him. He says, come, let's go to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. And we're going to pause right there because somebody needs to hear this today. He says, perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. You know why he says perhaps? Because Jonathan knows what maybe we need to know today, that we are responsible to be obedient to God. He's responsible for the results. We're responsible for following God. We're responsible for being obedient to God if we're followers of Christ, but it's God that's responsible for the results. So he says, maybe God will act on our behalf. I don't really know what God's going to do because I'm not God. I just know what I'm supposed to do. And I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do, whatever the outcome is. So perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. And so they go to this outpost. They bait them into a fight. Jonathan kills 20 of the men in this era, in this armor bearer that has no sword, and so they're outnumbered. But Jonathan conducts psychological warfare with them. He kills 20 men, and he ends up finding a way to win the entire battle with just those 20 men. So after these 20 men are killed at this outpost, the rumors go around, and panic breaks out in the Philistine army, both the camp and the field, including even the outpost and raiding parties. And just then, the earthquake struck, and everyone was terrified. And so they run away scared because Jonathan trusted God. Because Jonathan didn't know the outcome, but he chose to trust God. He'd watched his dad ignore God and suffer for it. And he said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be that guy. Jonathan's a lot like Jack, the character in the movie and the guy that sings in the song. He has it all. He's popular. He's rich. He's trying to pacify everyone in his life. And as a result, he's addicted to pleasing people. The other side of this might be David, right? The other person in our story is David. And this might be what you're familiar with David. You're welcome for blurring that out. The Medici in Florence, Italy, they actually commissioned Michelangelo to create the statue of David, but they didn't pay him enough money for him to have clothes. So he's a naked statue. I have no idea if that's true. I made that up. 100% made that up. But he is naked in that picture, so we're going to move on from that. You're welcome for blurring it out. But this is really a better representation of David in that era. David was also a little bit feminine, but he wasn't feminine. This picture is feminine, but he played the harp. It was an instrument that was common in that era, and he was a skilled harp player. But he was the youngest of 8 sons, and David was a shepherd. And being 8th in line meant that he was pretty much entitled to doing what he was doing for the rest of his life. He was pretty much entitled to being a shepherd. Inheritance would go to the firstborn. They didn't split it 8 ways. They didn't get 12.5% of the inheritance. And this is really true, I mean, even into modern culture, even into the 1800s. The guy who built Grand Central Station, the Vanderbilt family, and Vanderbilt University, and the Biltmore House in North Carolina, all of that family was known for giving 80 or 90 or even 95% of the inheritance to the oldest son so that they could maintain the family name and maintain the family wealth. And the rest of the family would work for him. And that's how it worked in David's era as well. So David was 8th in line for getting this inheritance. Otherwise, he might just get a nickel the day his dad died, right? There was no inheritance to come for him. And so a prophet comes by the house one day. He looks at all of his brothers who are standing there, and they can't find David. He's out with the sheep. And they said, these brothers aren't the one I'm looking for. I'm looking for the other one. And they said, what other one? Well, there's got to be another one. So the other one comes in. It's David. He's keeping the sheep. He pours oil on David's head, says, you're going to be the next king of Israel. And then he leaves, and everybody in the family is like, what just happened? What? This guy is not even getting a nickel when dad dies, and somehow he's going to be the king. So they laugh it off. But no doubt, this was something that the prophet told other people and something that got back to the king. King Saul would have known this. So years go by, and David is eventually asked to be a harp player for King Saul, who's tormented by the decisions that he's made. He's troubled by the decisions that he's made. And so they go back to war with the Philistines, and David and his 3 brothers, David's 3 brothers are in Saul's army, and David's there playing the harp and takes some food to his brothers. And so he was a skilled shepherd, and he killed lions and tigers and bears. And man, nobody has ever seen The Wizard of Oz? But he killed lions and tigers and bears. All right, we can try it 3 times. We can spend all day, people. I got all day. All right? That's not true. I'm already getting hungry. But David used his skills, right? He used his skills to protect the sheep. And so he gets out there. He starts hearing this giant Goliath who's talking badly about God. He's talking badly about the Israelites. And this is what he says. Here we go. David, he says, he asked the soldier standing nearby, what will a man get for killing this Philistine? So Goliath had stood up in front of the army and said, hey, if you people will come fight me, then we can avoid a war. If you'll just send out your champion, I'm the champion from the Philistines, we'll fight each other, and the winner will take all. And the loser doesn't have to die, you can just be slaves, and then everyone's better off. And so David hears this and says, what will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending the defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he's allowed to defy the armies of the living God? And so Saul, the king, he hears about David talking, running off at his mouth, and so he calls him in, and they have this conversation. David says, don't worry about that Philistine. I'll go fight him. And Saul's like, what? Don't be ridiculous. There is no way you can fight the Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth. He's incredibly experienced. And so David responds and says, well, it's the Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. And so it's always perplexed me because I grew up in a church, maybe some of you did too, and I always wondered, why would Saul send David to fight? It didn't make a lot of sense to me. Why would Saul send David to fight? Think of how much is on the line. He's got Jonathan in his back pocket, who killed 20 men, right? He's got the armor bearer of Jonathan, who's also probably a pretty popular guy. He's got great warriors in his army. No one's volunteered. He himself, Saul, is a great warrior. Why in the world would he ever choose to send David, who has no experience? He's not been in the army a day in his life. Why would he send his harp player to fight against Goliath? And here's what I believe, and here's what I think when we read the context of the story, we discover. Saul was willing to send David because it eliminated his problem. Saul's problem was he kind of hacked off God, not kind of, he had. And God had said, your family lineage is not going to be the lineage of the kings of Israel. And so he knew that David had been anointed to be the next king of Israel at some point. So he said, I'll just send David out there, then kill him, and that'll take care of things. In a few years, we'll get back in control. Jonathan will end up being king. All my problems are solved. But he doesn't expect what happens next. He doesn't expect David to kill Goliath. And then all of a sudden, there's a whole new set of problems in front of Saul. And a friendship that begins between David and Jonathan. Before Goliath, David definitely spent time in the palace. He definitely played the harp. King Saul would have known him, no doubt, and so would Jonathan, his son. They would have been acquainted. Jonathan would have known that David was chosen to be the next king. He would have known about the prophet who came by the house, poured oil on his head, and left. He would have known all that, and it would have made great sense after killing Goliath for those two to become friends, and they did. And it was their friendship, it was their relationship that provided a pathway to each of their purposes. Now, I was raised in Catholic school for many years, and it was a great experience, and I learned a lot of great things. But when I went to Catholic school, it was a predominantly Catholic area, and so as a Protestant in Catholic school, I wasn't Catholic. They made fun of us, and they told jokes about us, but it was fine because I would tell them stories from the Bible that they didn't know were there. And so it worked out really well. But I had this one story that I remember them kind of poking fun at us. They talked about these two boys who were best friends. And as they grew up, their friendship only deepened. One became a preacher, a Protestant preacher, and the other became a priest. And they would meet every week at the local coffee shop at Starbucks, no matter what else might be happening. And after one such meeting, they shook hands, they walked out the door, got to their cars. One was parked in the front of the restaurant, the other parked in the back. And as the one was coming around the front, they ended up colliding vehicles. And so there they were, stuck in the middle of the street, both cars smashed up. And so after making sure the other ones were safe, the preacher, he begged the priest that this incident wouldn't hurt their lifelong friendship. So the priest agreed. He reached in the glove box. He pulled out a small flask of whiskey, a couple of communion cups apparently he kept hanging around. He poured one full of whiskey and handed it to the preacher and said, "Here, let's drink to our friendship." The preacher said, "Here's to our friendship." He turned it up and he drank it. And as the priest put the whiskey back in his glove box, the preacher asked him if he wasn't also going to drink to their friendship. And the priest said, "Yes, but I'm going to wait until after the police leave first." There you go. So much for a true friendship, right? Relationships can certainly provide a pathway. Sometimes it's the pathway to prison or other places. Relationships will provide a pathway, but real relationships provide a pathway to our purpose. So that relationship began in 1 Samuel chapter 18. It really, really took a root. So David finished talking to Saul. He met with Jonathan, the king's son. And there was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. From that day on, Saul kept David with him, and he wouldn't let him return home. And when you look at the way that that's worded, it's really clear. Saul wanted to keep David around so he could have opportunity to monitor what was going on. It says, and Jonathan made a solemn pact with David. They have this conversation. Jonathan knows what's happening. He's observed the bravery of David. He says, because he loved him as he loved himself. And verse 4 says, Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David, together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. And this is a really monumental moment. And in fact, it's a very intentional choice. That's the first thing I want to write down, that real relationships are intentional. Real relationships are intentional. Sometimes you may read through that story and think, did they just strip down naked? Because that's a weird thing to do with your friend. And that's not what happened at all. It would have been an enormous symbol, a special mark of respect for a prince to give his own garments to somebody else to wear. The gift of a belt was a token of the greatest confidence and affection, and it was something that would be highly prized. It was like the decision he made to be a blood brother or a pinky swear in our modern era. And so by giving him some of his clothes, he didn't have to strip down naked. He would have had undergarments. We all wear more than one layer of clothes, especially in this era. They would have done the same thing. So when David and Jonathan met, there was simply a connection with one another. But they both loved God that really drew them towards that same purpose. Jonathan was older, more seasoned. David had little training on what it meant to be a military commander or a palace fixture. Jonathan was being trained to be king, but in the end, it was Jonathan who trained David to become the next king. Just like Jonathan seems to have it all. He has money, he's got fame, he's got the royal perks. He's a great general. He's accomplished great things. He's courageous, he's wise, he's loyal, he's an honorable person. And he has the potential to be one of the greatest kings in Israel. But he's caught between the hatred and paranoia of his father Saul, who was going insane, and the charisma and popularity of his best friend David. But he still chose to make an intentional choice to begin a relationship. Real relationships require intentionality. Most of the time, we don't stumble into it. Most of the time, it's something we began. The second thing I want to write down is that real relationships have love at the center. We just read that a moment ago, that love was at the center of this relationship. And the problem in David's life is that Saul wanted his legacy to keep going through Jonathan. And so he perceived David as standing in the way. So he tried to kill him a couple of times. He threw spears at him until eventually he would throw a spear, he'd apologize. David would play the harp. He'd throw another spear, he'd apologize. And somehow David just took this like it was normal. And eventually there's an all-out manhunt to kill David with a bounty on his head. And so he even orders his own son Jonathan to go after David and kill him. So Saul urges his servants and his son Jonathan to assassinate David, but Jonathan, because of his strong affection for David, told him what his father was planning. Tomorrow morning, he warned him, you must find a hiding place out in the field, and I'll ask my father to go out there with me, and I'll talk to him about you, and I'll tell you everything that I can find out. So Jonathan had promised to have a real relationship with David. He committed to protecting what God was going to do in his life, what that prophet had said all those years ago. Think about what's on the line for Jonathan. If he just does nothing and lets his dad find and kill David, he becomes king. He becomes the wealthiest person in his country. It's a great reward to do nothing. But he didn't. He rejected his own desire and chose David and God's will over his own gain. What would it take for you to make that sort of a choice, right? That's a challenging choice, to keep your dad from killing your best friend when you know it would cost you everything. What Jonathan represented to David was what Jesus would talk about a century later or a millennia later, and it's written in the book of John. He says, this is my commandment, love each other in the same way I've loved you. There's no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Which leads us to the third thing I want you to write down, that real relationships are sacrificial. They're intentional, they're founded in love, and they're sacrificial. Jonathan protects David. He feeds him information while Saul searches for him. Saul goes nuts. He's throwing spears at Jonathan for trying to protect David. He ends up killing a bunch of priests. He's burning down towns. He can't find David, so he starts checking every cave on the mountainside. And he can't find David or any of the men that are loyal to him. And at this point, they have a pretty strong army. He's searching with 3,000 experienced and elite soldiers. They've got swords and stuff. They're back in the business of winning wars. And so in 1 Samuel 24, it says, at the place where the road passes some sheepfolds, Saul went into a cave to relieve himself. Relieve himself. But as it happened, David and his men were hiding further back in that very cave. But David chose to spare Saul instead of trying to kill him when Saul was trying to kill David. He literally caught Saul with his pants down. Like, not figuratively, literally. And he didn't do anything about it. He didn't try to kill him because he cared about Jonathan, his friend. And he knew the wedge that would drive in their relationship. This happens again multiple times in their life. And eventually, the enemies of Saul, the Philistines, in their lifetime, they see that he's distracted chasing after some kid in a cave, and they bring their army to attack. So Saul and Jonathan and the army, they go to fight the Philistines, and Saul and Jonathan and their brother and his brothers are all killed in that war, in that battle rather. And while Jonathan loved David, he could never break from the cultural tradition to leave his father's service. And as a result of that addiction to pleasing his father, it would cost him his life. But he loved David. He enabled David. He empowered David. David doesn't become king if Jonathan isn't intentional, if he's not obedient to God, if he's not sacrificial of himself, and if he didn't love David the way that God loved him. David, a lot like Ali in the movie, in our song, he came from nothing. But he was talented. He was timid, especially at the beginning of his life. But he didn't have any means. He didn't have an audience. What David did have was the favor of God. So what does all this mean for us? Kenny, you've told a story about these two people. How does this relate to us? What does this relate in our world? I believe that real relationships provide a pathway to your purpose. Real relationships are important. We can't do life God's way without them. And it might be weird, but you've got to be aggressive about developing real relationships, about experiencing vulnerability, about inviting someone into your life. And that might mean that you need to let go of something before you can grab hold of something different. You might have to let go of your past in a difficult relationship or a bad small group or a bad group of people that you were vulnerable with that hurt you. You might have to let go of that in order to experience your future. Some of us keep people at a distance because of the hurt or pain or something that someone has done. Some of us have a trust issue. We can't seem to let things go. Last summer, my kids, we went to the beach for a family vacation, and there was just two of them, so they fit one in each arm, and they loved to go in the ocean. And I've already expressed, I don't like going in the ocean. That's where sharks live, right? If I don't go places where there's danger. I don't invite danger into my life unless it's very calculated. And so there's no way to calculate the danger of the ocean. And so they both want to get in the ocean. And so finally they talked me into it, and I'm taking them to the ocean. Well, they're 2 and 3 at that time, so they can't get in the ocean because the waves will knock them down. And so I'm, they think they're playing on the edge or whatever. They're playing in the sand. I picked them up and carried them into the ocean and took them out much further than I was comfortable with. And I began going further and further and further until eventually one of the kids looked at me and said, "Daddy, we're too far out. This is where the sharks live, and Mommy is far away." And I'm like, "Well, I got a knife. Which one?" I'm just kidding. I didn't really say that. I didn't do that. I'm a terrible person for even saying that. Wow. It's hard to listen to me, isn't it? But anyway, I'm looking at them, and they're saying, "Daddy, we're out too far. We're too far. It's too deep. We can't stay up in the water here." And I spent several minutes trying to explain to them, there's no way you can stand up in the water here, but there's no way you could stand up in the water in the shallow end. It's over your head. When those waves come in, they're going to knock you over. You can't do it. You can't stand up in the shallow end either. So let's just be in the deep end, because it doesn't really matter. You can't stand up either way. And I think about that in the context of our relationship with God, our relationship with others. We're in over our heads. Whether or not we want to admit it, we're in over our heads. It might make us feel better for there to be less water in that side of the pool, to be in the shallow, but we can't touch there either. This whole idea of relationships is way in over our heads. And here's what's so crazy about our culture and our world, right? 80% of people, according to Gallup, are spiritual people, but less than 20% are regular church attenders. So what did that gap tell us? It tells us that spirituality in our culture is individual. Individual spirituality is not Jesus' way of doing life. It requires real relationships. Individual spirituality, you pair that with the other truth that's occurred in the last 10 years, that relationships can be digital. And we know we're watching that happen. It doesn't work long term. So you have these digital relationships, this individual sense of spirituality, and as a result, most of us, our culture teaches us, we don't need real relationships. The church, it doesn't work. If you're a follower of Christ, you cannot find your purpose without real relationships. You can harbor, you can hold back, you can find all of these reasons to stay away from it, but let me tell you, you're going to be miserable. You're going to be miserable. You're never going to get to the purpose as a lone wolf Christian. That doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's not God's plan. It's not God's purpose for your life. Real relationships provide a pathway to our purpose. It requires a real relationship that's intentional, founded in love, and that's sacrificial. Real relationships are founded in what is truth. They're founded in who God is. And so I want to put those things up here. Real relationships that are intentional, that means maybe you need to take the initiative to invite somebody to spend time with them. You need to take the initiative to be vulnerable with somebody about a difficult thing. There's a lot of people that have invested in my life through the years. And if you're on the older end of that spectrum, I'm telling you, you might think young people aren't open to that conversation, but they absolutely are. Take initiative. Be intentional with a real relationship. Real relationships are founded in love. That means that we forgive things. That means we move past things knowing we're all broken. If you missed it last week, I talked about how you're all screwed up. We're all screwed up people. It's just who we are. It's the decisions we've made. And that real relationships are sacrificial. Most of us have a line, how far we're willing to go and maintain a friend. After that line, they're no longer a friend. They're no longer in the relationship. What if that line moved further and further and further and further until we accepted people for who they are? We experienced vulnerability in real relationships. So who do you need to ask this week to get together and talk about faith? Who do you need to encourage? What group do you need to get in? What thing do you need to show up to? If you're a follower of Christ, we need relationships. And if you're exploring your faith, don't get in if you think you can do it alone, because it doesn't work. Real relationships provide a pathway to our purpose. Let's pray. God, thanks for today. Thanks for your love. And thank you for putting people in our life that oftentimes are beacons for what you want from us in the future, or that point us in the direction of who we're becoming. And for those who may not yet be followers of you, God, we're grateful for the relationship reconciliation that takes place and took place when Jesus died on a cross, that he gave his life for what he considered friends, those who were his enemies. So, Father, if that's anybody here today, our pastor's been down front. We'd love to have a conversation with you about beginning your faith journey. And for those of us who are followers of Christ, give us the courage to develop real relationships and discover the purpose you have for our life. We ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.